Shift happens.
Herzlich willkommen zurück zu Shift Happens. Auch in dieser Woche haben wir eine Live-Folge für euch. Denn wir haben vor kurzem wieder den Morals Machines Award vergeben an eine ganz besondere Persönlichkeit. Ihr Name ist Alondra Nelson. Alondra Nelson war Chefin des White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Sie war Wissenschaftsberaterin von Präsident Joe Biden und sie hat als Expertin in Technologiepolitik zusammen mit US-Vizepräsidentin Kamala Harris an den ersten US-Regulierungen zu KI-Anwendungen gearbeitet. Der UN-Generalsekretär Antonio Guterres berief sie in das Beratungsgremium zu KI der Vereinten Nationen. Und inzwischen forscht und lehrt Alondra Nelson als Professorin am Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in den USA. Miriam hat mit ihr beim Ada Lovelace Festival dieses Jahr ein Bühnengespräch geführt über Technologiepolitik, auch über die Wahl Donald Trumps als wiederkehrenden US-Präsidenten und darüber, was es bedeutet, eigentlich verantwortungsvolle Technologien zu entwickeln. Und das präsentieren wir euch heute. Hier kommt das Gespräch mit Alondra Nelson.
Alondra, you're here in a crazy week, during a crazy week.
What do you mean? Whatever do you mean?
The US elections yesterday morning, yesterday evening, the German government collapsed, so we will need to talk a bit about politics. But that's not why you're here. You're here because of your wonderful work, and I would like to start with that.
Sure.
So let's dive right into it. We are talking a lot about responsible AI. Mm-hmm. While we know that technology can never be responsible, only humans in applying technology can be responsible. Isn't that already the wrong approach?
I mean, I think that we can demand that our tools and technologies are responsible or trustworthy or ethical. I mean, I think we use different frameworks. But we've spent, even before the ChatGPT kind of moment, we spent the last 5 years sort of saying that and not showing people how to do that. And so I think now what we're facing is the implementation of that. And part of what we tried to begin to show in the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights is, if we want to say AI systems should be safe and effective, what does that look like? So what should consumers know? What should designers do? What should developers do? So we really, I think all of our organizations at some point have said these are the principles of responsible, ethical / trustworthy AI that we want to live by. And the challenge that we face as societies now is, how do you do that in practice? And the doing in practice moves us from thinking it's a quality that's inherent to the technology, it never is, to taking, being in the driver's seat of how these technologies fulfill those outcomes that we expect of them.
Mm-hmm. And one part of learning and doing it right would be that we implement fairness and transparency in the processes. Also, again, probably not in the technology, because if we talk about AI, we talk about basically large language models as black boxes. Sure. How do we deal with that?
Well, I think we first need to admit that it's hard. I mean, we've been asking for transparency in the governance space for 7 or 8 years, like starting with algorithmic application and social media. So it's technically hard, it's politically hard, and that's okay, but it's also not impossible. But I do think that we need to be honest that it's not easy, and that it takes trade-offs between rushing a product to market and making sure that something, is trustworthy. It takes trade-offs, and I think in government with, wanting to have a relationship with companies that's helping them to drive and lean into innovation, but also saying, are we checking on this transparency piece, for example? And, we'll have, I think companies, rightly or wrongly, think that there's trade-offs between transparency and privacy or these sort of things. So, much like sort of figuring out how to build the trustworthy, the ethical, responsible AI, we also need to be able to build the sort of muscle in our organizations for this as a standard expectation of the work that we do. And, the conversation that you had with Verena a few moments ago is fascinating in a lot of ways, but one of the things that she raised was around the lack of trust. And so I think from the perspective of someone, I haven't worked in government in over a year, but from the perspective of someone who worked in government and who started in the Biden-Harris administration on the first day at the kind of peak of the pandemic, like trust was low, trust remains very low. And that transparency piece and figuring that out is certainly one of the ingredients and any kind of recipe for institutions and governments in particular to get closer to trust. I don't think that we know what the full recipe is, but certainly being more transparent with people is one of those elements.
Mm-hmm. And part of building that muscle you have talked about is also probably something we need to build in the process of coming up with new governance approaches, new regulation, new applications for technology. When I look at the AI Bill of Rights, you enabled basically. You had a very specific consultation process that you set up. Can you share that a bit, what you did there?
Yeah, so it comes out of that. It comes out of the experience of starting to work in government service during a pandemic and in the context of just low trust. And so the question for us going into the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy was, how do you make effective science and technology policy in a context of low trust? And I think that was a different question. I mean, it's a question we should have been asking ourselves for decades, for generations, but it became very more acute and urgent in the context of, American and global society saying, we don't trust experts, we don't trust institutions, we don't trust these vaccines, et cetera.
And that was not only in the US.
Of course not, right,
over.
Of course. Yeah. And so that meant that if we were going to try, so the sort of raison d'etre of an office like the Office of Science and Technology Policy, of which there are comparable offices in Germany and the EU, is that the experts do it, right? The sort of technocrats and the experts do it, and then we listen, and and we're supposed to trust them because they're the experts. And we knew that was sort of beginning to erode. And so we wanted to advance some work that had been done, frankly, in both administrations, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, to sort of develop some sort of high-level sort of principles, guardrails, et cetera, around AI governance. But we wanted to think about how you do it in a way that engaged the public. Yeah. And that meant for us, as experts, as scientists, as social scientists, that we needed to figure out a way to talk to the public about this and not have them feel like they have to have a PhD in computer science to be able to engage in a political conversation, a conversation about the demos with regards to what the implications of AI for that. So we started with an op-ed in Wired. We wrote, and myself and a colleague in leadership in OSTP wrote an op-ed in Wired that had an email address that went to the White House. You can still find it online. You can still, at least for this White House, write to that email address. And we just asked people, AI is, expanding rapidly in our lives. What do you want it to look like? We invoked the Bill of Rights, although that's not the title we sent the Wired editors. They really wanted to sort of go with the AI Bill of Rights frame. But in the US context, you create a constitution, and then the Bill of Rights are really to put these additional checks on what was, with the US government and its founding, become a very powerful system. So it was a kind of metaphor for how you put checks on a very powerful system. And that helped us to really contact and be in contact with lots of people. So we had almost a year of deliberation. We spoke to religious people. So we talked to sort of rabbis, and we engaged with the Vatican. We talked to homemakers. We talked to high school students. And sort of meeting in a space that was, as policymakers, it was our responsibility to both listen and also to help explain, or, and to listen to and to translate, right? So to translate, when someone said, I'm worried about my husband's job if we have these AI systems or tools, we need to translate that into policy language. We don't need that person to say they're concerned about their husband. They don't need to be able to say to us, what tool, what system, what company, we need to be able to do that translation work. And we took that responsibility as part of our work as policymakers. So that started a year-long conversation. We, of course, talked to people in startups, people in big tech, academic researchers, people in civil society. But we really wanted to have this public piece. And so that also meant that we had a series of workshops that were sort of topical with regards to issues in AI policy. We also took a page from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, which has these public hearings, and everyone can just speak for 2 minutes. So there's a 2-minute timer, and you get a 2-hour window, and anyone can say anything they want for 2 minutes. And so we just listened, and we did them at different times of day. So it could be after school, before work, et cetera. And we just took in all of this information. And the AI Bill of Rights doesn't make any claims to novelty. So the point for government doesn't want to be new. That's not a good place for government to be. Government is never going to be the most innovative with ideas or technologies. But what we can do is sort of platform, effectively, you can platform what are the best practices and ideas around how we can get to what we thought were the sort of high-level principles that we were hearing from the American public. They were expecting their tools and technologies as they got more powerful to do and to abide.
I think there's a lot in there that Verena could take for her conversations with politics, because I think also changing the process is so important to help people understand and get a buy-in and develop trust. You just said that Wired came up with a Bill of Rights. They put it in the headline. Basically?
We had it in the body. I mean, that was always the kind of metaphor. But I think our title was something very terrible and wonkish. It was something like, how automated systems and AI can help people do the thing, it was very long. That
helps fall asleep.
Almost like a German word, right?
Yeah, almost, yeah. I think it's actually a really good move to use this phrase of the Bill of Rights. I mean, there is a Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution from 1791, when I remember rightly, that signals something. And I think it actually does signal the right thing.
Yes.
We are talking about a change in technology that affects our basic rights.
Yes. And it's the Bill of Rights language has become a very it's a form of political discourse in American culture. So Ralph Nader, if you might remember, who's a consumer advocate, came up with the Consumer Bill of Rights. During the Obama administration, there was a Patient Bill of Rights. And so the bill of sort of going back to that foundational document and sort of making claims based on that, the anchoring in that document, is a very kind of American tradition, let's say. I think where things got complicated. I mean, so part of what we were doing over the course of this year was also trying to get this document cleared, having worked in government, out of government, which means that every federal agency that thinks that they have some equity, meaning that they have some piece of this that pertains to them, got the opportunity to redline, to have a meeting, to talk about it. So it went through a lot of conversation, not just with the broader public, but also in government. And, the White House counsel's office was like, Bill of Rights. Is the White House saying it's an actual right? So, I mean, it's very different, I think, to come from Ralph Nader and a consumer organization than for it to come from the White House. And so the lawyers had some but we worked through it, but it took some time.
When you look at your time at the White House and the beginnings, like the AI Bill of Rights, and we had the AI framework by NIST, by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We had some self-regulation amongst groups of companies. That was the start.
Yeah.
I have the feeling that now we basically moved into the more serious stuff, the more serious regulation, which is probably because the technology has evolved. Do you agree with that?
I think it's all serious, so maybe not more, but I think we're now variously in a lot of these policy streams that have been happening around the world in kind of an implementation stage.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's when things get hard and tricky. So, I've obviously been watching what's been happening with the EU Act. I mean, there's and so it's been interesting to see the battles that are happening over the implementations of pieces of regulation that have already been fought over for many years already, right? And so that's ongoing. In the United States, in the state of Colorado, we have a lot of the really interesting, innovative work on AI regulation is being done in the states, California and Colorado in particular. And Colorado has a kind of omnibus, comprehensive bill that companies were on board with, civil society was on board with, but now that it's in the implementation, the industry lobbyists are, it's becoming a very kind of intricate dance. And so, but I think it is good that we are in a place that we have laws on the books. And I often think, in part because we have to in the United States, because we have at the federal level so few laws. And with regards to AI regulation, I think about governance broadly, which includes laws and formal regulation. But we've got to really think about standard setting, like a body like NIST does. Changing norms in industry, for example, and actually changing consumer expectations about the products, for example. There's a lot of different, I think, levers that we should be using, and we're in that stage, which I think is exciting.
What do you think about the EU AI Act?
I actually think it's pretty good. And I think, in the United States, I remember when there was this sort of pause after the introduction of ChatGPT and generative AI as a consumer product. And, there were some in the United States who said, it doesn't even work. They have to stop it to sort of incorporate this other thing. What I thought was great for me about the process, and what I think is so important for AI governance and the governance of any kind of new and emerging technologies, of which there are going to be many more. And so part of why this moment is critical is that we're going to have to figure out how to do this for a lot of other technologies, right? We're going to have to figure out how to do this for quantum computing if that becomes, really viable. We're going to have to figure out how to do it for fusion. There's all of these new technologies that are going to be technology plus AI that are going to have these very dynamic qualities that are very different from regulations we had created around automobiles or toasters or whatever. And so I appreciated that the EU process had a moment in it where you could have a little bit of agility. I mean, I know many people would not describe that process as agile, but that you could sort of pause and sort of say, okay, before we lock this, we're going to have a conversation about this new technology and think, are the risk levels that we're putting in place and the various definitions that we're putting in place appropriate for what we know is the cutting edge or the frontier. And I think that was really admirable. I think all of us are thinking about, Mario Draghi's caution around growth and how to think about that relationship to innovation, between innovation and growth. And so it's worth looking at. But I don't think that means one has to toss out the EU AI Act. I think one needs to implement it with an eye to innovation, right? There's latitude and implementation, and I think that will be, the challenge.
Maybe one of the distinctions that can help to understand a bit the debate around it, and that, is that basically the US approach is more like regulate sector specific. So because different applications in different sectors have different ranges of dangers and challenges.
Yes.
The EU takes a risk-based approach and looks at a realm of technology in itself, which is a different approach. What do you prefer?
I think you actually need both.
You need both?
I think you need both. So
why?
Because for generative AI and, as there becomes new, maybe consumer-facing uses of, neural networks and deep learning, et cetera. We don't know the world of possible use cases. So to lock on risks, you can't anticipate all of the potential risks. So I think it constrains you a little bit. You can, but I think that, thinking about risk in sector. So if you think about healthcare, we know, at least in the United States, to the extent that we have any privacy law in the United States, it's in the healthcare sector. And so we know that we have a higher expectation for privacy, for data privacy, for the privacy of electronic health records, for example, in that sector. But it's also high risk because it's people's, well-being. But we actually don't know what that's going to mean all the time over time. And are there uses, of these technologies that are seemingly low risk, but that are, because of the sector, need additional scrutiny? So there was, in the United States, I spoke to some Associated Press reporters about OpenAI has a tool called Whisper that many of us have used. And if you're using it, somebody's using it now to transcribe our conversation, fantastic. What this reporting showed is that the use of Whisper in healthcare, the hallucinations were just coming up with crazy things that were dangerous for people's well-being. So
it's also that Whisper was used to basically transcribe all YouTube videos to train ChatGPT, which is illegal. So
not in the United States yet. We don't know.
Well, it's a debate around that.
It is very much debated. It's very much debated. So, which is to say, like a case like that, I think is at the crosscut of risk and sector. Because there are other uses for Whisper, like, it's like, let's stipulate that it's pseudo-legal and that one should be using it, that we wouldn't really care, that we wouldn't worry about it having a risk. So I think we need to figure out a way to do kind of something in the middle and also to leave ourselves space for uses that we can't even anticipate. I mean, I think, particularly young people are using AI in ways that, many of us here can't even anticipate.
I like that you just introduced a third category for regulation in times of transformation, pseudo-legal. That's
because I'm not a lawyer. Any of the lawyers in the room are mortified.
That's very nice, because that's basically alluding to another question I had regarding the EU AI, because you said, it's good when we take a moment and think about the technology that evolves so fast, and the EU did that because at the beginning they didn't even talk about large language models, and then oops, suddenly they were there, and everything had changed. But how can we make sure that some kind of adaptability, of some kind of agility or dynamic is in regulation when regulatory processes are what they are and technology is evolving like that?
I would say there's a couple of things. So one is the framing, we often rightly celebrate the disruption economy. Harvard Business School, business schools are teaching the disruption and the disruption economy. Part of what that strategy is going around through finding a loophole in the law. So the framing that says government's too slow and the law is too slow is ignoring the fact that the whole part of this particular business model, Uber, for example, in a place like New York City, where you've had this medallion model for how taxis were driven, the whole point of the company was to get around the law. So of course the law is going to be behind, right? That's actually driving the work. So I think it's important to remember that framing. And I do think that we need government to be, there's the metaphor of the tortoise and the hare in the race. And we need, I think, government to be both of those things. So you do want, in the space of government policymaking, for government to take its time. You don't want government to be a first mover, I think, in anything, actually. You want to leave that to entrepreneurs and others. It's just government's not great at that. So, but you do want it to move more quickly. And so I think the US model, part of the sector-specific strategy emerges in part because it's very clear in the US context that we're not going to get comprehensive federal legislation. So then one has to look for spaces of policy innovation, another kind of innovation, and the laws that you have, right? Which says if a scam is illegal or fraud is illegal or, doing X thing on the dark web is illegal, then it's also illegal if you do it with AI, for example. And so there's that piece, which is just sector specific, has become, it's what we have. You're using the tools that you have, right? And that's not to say that there are not kind of new laws and rules that might be needed, new norms. But I also think we need to reimagine not just government, but all organizations. So I know a lot of schools are facing this, universities and colleges, what are we going to do around AI? Do we need to rewrite our entire honor code or whatever for this organization? And I think in some ways that's the wrong question, right? If the honor code, what you're trying to if you're trying to do is have people have a moral, ethical orientation to themselves and to others in a community, then those values don't change. How you have to get to them might change, but that sort of high level doesn't change. And I think it's important, on the one hand, to remember that. On the other hand, it's also important, I think, to leave space for agility. And I call it versioning or iteration. So, you mentioned the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US, NIST, which is more than 100 years old organization. It's one of the oldest. It's mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. I know that's not old here, but allow me, go with that. It's pretty old, but not old from the European context. But so NIST is one of the few kind of government offices that's mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It's a very old organization, and its whole job was to do weights and measures, was to help commerce and trade by sort of standardizing how people did trade. And so what's been inspiring, first in the cybersecurity space and then in the space of AI, is that NIST has started to create documents, guidance documents, and frameworks, right? NIST is not a regulatory agency, but it can create guidance and frameworks. And they've started with cybersecurity first and now with AI to call it a V.1. So like software versioning, right? That this is the guide that we're creating right now for how we think we should manage risk for AI in this moment. So the last was released in January of 2023, and it leaves open the possibility that one could quickly change. So I don't know if that's a V1.1 or a V2.0, right? I don't know what the significance of the change may be, but to build into our mindsets from the very beginning that this is just the first iteration, our first take on how we might govern AI and have a risk management framework, I think is really important, because a lot of how we've thought about guidance, guardrails, frameworks has been a really good law will last for a generation. We're going to pass a law we want, and we're living with the outcome of that in the United States. So in 1996, we passed the Communications Decency Act, which has Section 230 in it, which says that, basically platforms are neutral. They are not editors. They just host things. And so that platforms are not liable. And we're really living and good ways and bad ways with what that means. And that's a 30-year plus law, and I think if one could have imagined that law or written into that law, we don't know what this internet thing is in 1996. And we're going to come back, bake into the law. We're going to come back in 5 years and think about whether or not we need to sunset it or revise it. If we could begin, I think, to think about the governance of new and emerging technologies that way, it would do a world of good.
Yeah, I love the idea. Software versioning and taking some part of it to make governance processes a little bit more agile. Wonderful. Alondra, yesterday, Donald Trump was elected as the next president of the United States for a second time. How did it feel to be abroad?
It was, well, we talked about this. I thought I voted early, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be here, and how's that going to feel? But we'd already made our decision, and so it was what it was. So I should be very clear. I worked in the Biden-Harris administration for 2 years and 2 months. I worked with Vice President Harris on science and technology policy. I think she would have been a tremendously excellent president. I think she's, she's just good. She's good. She's smart. A lot of the U.S. perspective on AI governance in this administration, which tries really hard to balance rights issues and innovation issues, and she gave a wonderful speech in the London U.S. Embassy in London last November, actually, which she said it's a false choice that we have to choose those, and how can government help to make us be able to achieve both. So she would have, for those of us in this room, she would have been a tremendous leader for. She's chair of the National Space Council in the U.S., so she does a lot of thinking about space policy, STEM, some of which you talked about before, and STEM commerce in the space in that world. So for the policy issues that I care about, the intellectual issues I care about, it's a particularly tremendous, acute loss in that space. But I think it's a loss for us all in a lot of different ways. And so I felt deeply disappointed. I still feel deeply disappointed. But I also think, if that's what the electoral process will bear, we have a lot of other questions to ask ourselves as, American society, if we have reached a place where, we think it's okay and admirable. I think it will turn out to be that Donald Trump will have, if I'm reading the data correctly, also have won the popular vote, which he hadn't in the past. So the majority of Americans, I think, are backing, a leader who, denigrates people, denigrates women, denigrates lots of people in the national community that he sought to lead or seeks to lead.
He's also a convicted felon.
Sure. Yes. There's all of that. There's lots to say, but I also think, but I think more importantly, that just the policy is just wrong. I think. The Biden-Harris administration has done a tremendous job with the CHIPS and Science Act, with the Inflation Reduction Act, to really, I think, be agile with government. I was following the conversation that you all are just having. There's a lot of things we don't want bureaucracy to do. There's a lot of things we don't want government to do. what government can do in spaces like AI and spaces like when you're trying to, sort of change the dynamics of supply chains for semiconductors, for example, is to help create a market where a market doesn't exist, right? So I think in the 20th century context, we think about government as being for research and development, and you stop there and turn it over to the companies. I think what the Biden-Harris administration has done that's been really important is say, these supply chains are just not going to move themselves. And if we have national security interests and we have innovation interests and other kinds of concerns, it's the role of government to help, not pick winners and losers, but to create an incentive structure for this change to happen. Mm-hmm. Similarly, with the Inflation Reduction Act and thinking about a transition to clean and green energy, to electronic vehicles and the like. So I think those are good cases, but there's some indication that, in a new Trump administration, that those will be dismantled, or at least, if the laws aren't dismantled, not emphasized or not implemented. I mean, the thing with implementation is one also can not do it. Mm-hmm. So we'll have to see, but I think the policy implications for things that what we're initially hearing from voters that they cared about are not going to be better in a second Trump administration, and so it's disappointing personally because I know how excellent a leader Vice President Harris is, but it's also I think disappointing for the aspirations that we have for having more access, more opportunity, more rights for more people as a central mission of American society.
Yeah. We have heard a lot, because Donald Trump talked about it a lot, about tariffs and trade, and about lack of independence we can probably expect regarding some agencies like the Fed or the Department of Justice. We haven't heard much about technology, science, and AI during the election campaign. It didn't play a large role. Regarding this field of politics, what do you expect from a Trump government?
It's hard to know. I mean, I was actually a little bit surprised it didn't. I guess I felt two ways about it not playing a bigger role in the campaign. On the one hand, I was surprised just because there has been so much light and heat in public discourse around AI over the last, year and a half, 2 years. When we got ChatGPT as a public, you all have been doing this for 10 years. It only became 2 years. It was only 2 years ago that the broader public became really interested in these issues. So I was surprised on that level. On the other hand, I thought, when our technologies work well, they kind of hum in the background of our lives and they don't have to consume every topic that we're doing. So part of me also thought there's a way I think that science and technology policy is going to be increasingly important, is more important than ever because it is part of every policy issue. So there's not an issue in agriculture or labor or healthcare or science research, basic research that doesn't have some science and technology policy thing. And so there's a way in which it should just be in the background, and maybe it shouldn't be it's not an actual policy pillar, maybe it's a crosscut of all policy. Mm-hmm. And if that was the approach I think that we were sort of maturing into, then I think maybe it was okay if it wasn't a top, sort of campaign issue. Although it did come up obviously around different positions on crypto and digital assets and these sorts of things. So when the differences. So a couple of things. There are some similarities, which is the first Trump administration, so we came in right after, didn't do a lot of science and technology policy, actually. So the office that I led for a time in the Obama administration had about 150 people in it. When we came in the Biden-Harris administration, the office had been reduced to 30 people. Wow. So it was not a central focus of the first Trump administration. President Trump didn't hire a science advisor for the first 2 years, so it was only in the last 2 years that there was a science advisor. That said, the policy that they did well in that office and that administration was around AI policy. So there's very much a kind of baton passing, or there has been up to this point, from the work that the Obama administration was doing, which was creating, issuing kind of big think pieces on the implications of what we then called big data. By 2016, the Obama administration is thinking about work and, equity issues in AI. This is kind of one of the last big white papers that they would do. And that's really taken up in the Trump administration, that issues 2 executive orders on AI, one of which, really asks government to lean into civil rights issues, civil liberties issues. Privacy is part of the work of government engaging and using AI tools and systems. And so what we came in the Biden, and those were issued in the last days of the first Trump administration. And so in the Biden administration, we read them. We said, look, fine, we're going to implement them. But, again, as I said, there is latitude in implementation. So we implemented them very much with the priorities of President Biden very much in mind.
But that is also an example. I mean, Donald Trump issued an executive order on AI in 2019.
2, yeah, 2.
Even 2, yes. And basically, it's quite similar. How you described it, just you went along with it because it made sense. But he said one day thing he will do when he's in office is repeal
the
Biden executive order, which is based on his own executive order.
Yes.
What is happening there?
So we'll see. I mean, I think that there's some political theater around, presidents coming in and rescinding the prior, that's just, I can, and I'm president now, and we're just going to do it a different way. I think there's lots of fundamental things, both that come from the Trump executive orders and that are in President Biden's executive order, which is admittedly much more comprehensive and extensive. It covers kind of nearly every part of government. That I think will probably be versions of which will be baked into a new Trump executive order. So what I don't think is going to happen is that the Biden executive order gets rescinded and there's no executive order in AI. I think it will follow quite quickly with another that will, I think, have different phrasing, but be, I think, in some ways much the same, which is, how to maintain American leadership, how to, think about the national security risks and opportunities, how to think about the commercial risks and opportunities, the opportunities for government services, and to keep the public trusting that these technologies can be beneficial. The thing that's really changed since the Trump administration is this public-facing life of AI. And so it will be, I'll be interested to see. I mean, there is a lot of public concern. There's a lot of polling in the United States. There's a lot of international polling. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which measures kind of trust, did a series of questions on AI for 2014 that came out in March that you can find online. And they did an international survey, and it's 50% or countries that have 50% or more distrust in AI were Western democracies, right? France, Canada, US, Australia, I'm sure Germany is on there. I mean, it's actually shocking. And so that says even for a President Trump that you've got to be thinking about implementation. Like if you actually want this market to flower and to succeed, if you have workers and consumers who are not going to use the technology so they don't trust them, like you've got to have an answer for that. And some of that means requiring transparency, requiring, some attestations of responsibility, of ethics, of trustworthiness and the like.
Yeah. Let's zoom out, coming to an end, and looking at, for example, a survey I just read, I think it was New York Times, finding out that about half of the American people don't trust democracy any longer. Looking also at, you could say that the American people in 2016 didn't know what they were voting for exactly. This time, they must have known quite well. Looking at what Donald Trump has announced during his campaign, like taking away the independence of the Fed and the Department of Justice and prosecuting his political enemies, would you, without any hesitation, still say America is a democracy?
Yes, but I think, we say democracy as if it is an edifice, as if it is a schloss, so, that it's something that you build and it stays there for all time, as opposed to democracy being something that you have to actively fight for. and that you have to, that is actively, that's a dynamic thing. And, so I think that what you can't do is say, we're a democracy, great, and carry on. And I think certainly what we may be facing in the second Trump administration is really having to fight every day to ensure that the answer to that is we are fighting for it, that it is an action, that making democracy true and possible is an action that we're going to have to be struggling over every day. And I think that's okay. I mean, I do think that, I started by saying, the question we had to ask ourselves when I went into government was, what does it mean to govern or to make policy in a context of low trust, right? Instead of just assuming that everyone trusts you and thinks experts are amazing. I think it also, for us, the question is, what does it mean to not just assume the rule of law, equality before the law, and to be very clear, as disappointing as it may be, to be honest with ourselves, that has got to be struggled for every day. And that's the work that we face, and that's what we'll do.
And is it also part of democracy that a tech leader like Elon Musk can spend about $120 million, giving $1 million to everyone registering for Donald Trump?
I mean, this remains to be seen. This is the U.S. court system that says, that we can have PACs and super PACs that can give money. This is the U.S. tradition that says corporations are people and that they have voice and can speak. And so, the money situation and American elections, I mean, is terrible. And it is, as we're familiar with the kind of race in business, but you're creating a kind of racing and politics as well. There's active open litigation around some of what Elon Musk has done to, giving $1 million to people to effectively register to vote, et cetera, et cetera. That's quite a big incentive. And I think we'll see, I think bringing that culture of disruption to norms around voting and elections is, I think something that people working in the regulatory space of elections hadn't anticipated and are going to we'll have to figure that out.
I would like to end with 3 words. I would like to hear from you. And I give you the context. It's about the connection between power, progress, and scientific discovery. In 1962, Venus became the first planet in our solar system to receive a radio message from Earth, transmitted from a Soviet radar complex, and as much directed to the other parts of Earth as to the imagined inhabitants of Venus. And it consisted of 3 words in Russian. These 3 words were peace, Lenin, USSR. What message would you suggest to send out today into the universal void? 3 words.
Oh gosh, what a great question. We'd keep peace. Understanding, maybe understanding / respect. What would be the other? Imagination.
Peace, understanding, respect, and imagination. I'm sure the modern technology has space for 4 words this time.
Yeah.
Alondra Nelson.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
So much fun. Really. I love that question.
I loved it when I read it.
Yeah.
Shift happens.